Hi everyone, I'm Karen Longdon. I'm the Lead Development Manager for the Sustainable Catering certifications for the Soil Association's Food for Life team. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how food served in the public sector and those procurement choices can go towards solving some of the problems that we have with food, both in the UK and globally. And there's not just me speaking today. Sorry, I won't be 1 second. My there we go. Wasn't working. It's not just me speaking today. We've also got Lucy Wardle from Food for Life Scotland, who'll be showing what's possible in public sector sourcing and how Food for Life served here is driving positive change. We've got Rich Osborne, who'll be talking about the critical role of public sector dynamic food procurement. And hopefully we've got Nigel Crane, who works up in Lancashire for Lancashire County Council, and he'll be talking about their model of food procurement and how they're supporting local food producers and suppliers. Hopefully Nigel will be joining us. If not, then I know a lot about what they're doing up there, so I'll jump in there. So we all know that food is an imperative factor in combating climate change, and we can all have an impact on this. And what I wanted to do to start with was I've got a little bit of a fact quiz really, and I just want to think about how much food has changed over just one generation. So in the last sort of 70 years, my dad's in his late 70s, and when I talk to my dad about food, he has sort of a very different experience from when he was young, and that's just one generation ago. And we talk a lot about the issues that we have around food and food security and procurement. And I just think it's interesting to look back at a history of what we've done with food and where it's come from. So please feel free. I can't see the chat at the moment, but feel free to sort of put what you think in the chat, or even unmute yourselves. And if anybody wants to give an answer to any of the questions, and we can have a little bit of discussion about this. So after the Second World War, food was rationed. Does anybody know when rationing on meat and bacon ended after the Second World War? Would anybody like to have a guess at that?
Early 50s, perhaps?
Yeah, it was 1954 actually. So that's a full 9 years after the war ended, before rationing on meat and bacon ended. And I think we'll see going through what I'm talking about now, how meat then was seen as a luxury item, and it didn't feature on the menu all that much because most people couldn't actually afford to eat too much meat. So it was a real sort of luxury. So how many allotments do you think there were in 1950 in the UK? Around allotments, and this is allotments that were actually designated as allotments, maybe not just people growing in their backyard. So how many allotments do you think there were? Anybody?
I can't imagine there were as many as now, because
no, that's right, there were actually around about 1.2 million allotments back in 1950. And by 1968, that had dropped to just under 500,000. And we know now that there's a big demand for growing spaces. And in the past, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of this sort of traditional growing spaces were taken out to build accommodation, housing. And that sort of growing space wasn't really taken into consideration there. And I know just in my little town where I live up in Lancashire, there's 160 people on the waiting list for an allotment. And I know that's replicated across the country. So people are really interested in food, growing food, and where food comes from. And in 1950, so this is just 71 years ago, the average person in the UK ate 1 kilogram of chicken annually. So 1 kilogram of chicken per year is what was eaten on average. Can anybody sort of have a guess as to what the average is now for chicken? Does anybody want to hazard a guess?
50.
Yeah, it's actually 25 kilograms per year, which I didn't think sounded that much. But if you take into account that's an average of the population, so it includes anybody that doesn't eat meat, you know, it's quite a lot, and it's increased a lot. And this is what I was talking about, food and meat, particularly being a luxury item. We tend to find that chicken now would be a loss leader in the supermarket, and the sort of farming practices of raising chickens have altered considerably. And then again, in 1950, how many supermarkets do you think there might have been in the UK back then? So just 70 years ago. Anybody want to guess?
Less than 1,000.
Yeah, there was 50. There was 50 supermarkets in 1950, and 43 of them were around the London area. So that's not including the sort of traditional end of street corner shops. By 2013, that had risen to 10,300. And now you're looking at around 87,000. And if we think of the sort of rise of the Aldis and Lidls, there's an Aldi in just about every town now. So that's where the majority of people actually do the shopping. And this is one for sort of my generation. But when do you think the first fast food outlet opened in England? And does anybody know what it was? And when I talk about fast food, I'm not talking about fish and chip shops. I'm talking about a burger joint where you actually went in and had burger, or a Knickerbocker Glory, which gives you a clue.
I'm going to guess a Wimpy.
It was a Wimpy, yeah. And the first ever Wimpy opened in London in 1954. And yeah, I remember going when I was a child with my family. And now, I mean, there's over 26,000 similar sort of food outlets. There's around 1,400 McDonald's, around 1,000 KFCs, over 500 Burger Kings. So yeah, when I talked to my parents about the food that they had, I mean, they didn't eat out. They didn't really eat out at the home unless it was fish and chips on a Thursday when my dad got paid. They didn't eat a lot of meat. A lot of their vegetables were actually grown. And they can't really remember having things like avocados. Now there's over 116,000 tons of avocados imported into the UK each year. My dad can't remember avocados from his childhood, other than in some of the sitcoms that were there served avocado and prawn when they were being sort of having a posh buffet, if you will. But it's just not how people ate, and all of this change over the last generation has really impacted on the factors around health, nature, and climate change through food. So if we think, this is Kevin Bacon, if anybody doesn't know. So what do I just wanted you to think about what Kevin Bacon might have in common with me, or Donald Trump, or I don't know, Floella Benjamin, or somebody like Mo Salah, or Kate Winslet, or anybody really. What does he have in common? And yeah, of course, the answer is food. And it's something that connects every single human being, because we need to eat. Everybody needs to eat. And for most people, well, I know for me, food is probably the highlight of my day. It's the thing that I think about in the morning. I plan what I'm going to eat during the day. And I think that's the same for a lot of people. A lot of the work that we do in hospitals and care settings and schools, and people are thinking about their food experiences through the day and what that's going to bring. So every food connects everybody. So that means that it's something that every human being can change. So everybody in their own way can impact on how we eat and what impact that food has. So another little thought. Think about what you had for your dinner last night, and just try and think about where that might have come from. So supermarket, quite normal. The majority of people now do all their shopping in a supermarket, and will never really step foot in another shop for food. They just buy everything, and some people shop for everything in a supermarket, including clothes. They're just accessible. Local markets, usually where we have local markets throughout the country. You know, we've got a local market, it's lovely. Maybe a local shop, a local processor like a bakery or a fishmonger or something like that. Or maybe we start thinking further back into the supply chain, so looking at wholesalers and some of the larger wholesalers, or a large processor. You know, lots of food is processed. Or perhaps, you know, you're lucky enough to have access to one of your local farms, and you actively go out and buy meat from your local farm. Or perhaps you had something that might have come from a global producer, an avocado, for example, that I've already mentioned, or maybe a jackfruit curry that's been grown outside the UK and imported. So suddenly, when we talk about food, when we think about where food comes from, it sounds a little bit more complicated. And I think what I'm trying to highlight here is that when we think about where our foods come from, we sometimes have to go back a long way and think globally rather than locally. Because even if you buy something from your local store or your local market, it's really got little bearing on where in the world that food's originated from. Before it reaches your plate, it's probably travelled halfway across the world by air or by sea or even by road. It will have been processed, whether that's primary processing or something more intense, like some food products. It will have been packaged perhaps several times over, but actually it comes from one place in reality. And if we bring it back to that original question that I asked you, where did your dinner last night come from? Most of the time the answer will go back to soil, because just about all the food that we eat does come from the soil, even when we go right back down the supply chain. And so really, when we think about this really complex food system that we have, it boils down to one ingredient. Mineral and organic matter clustered in aggregates full of holes for air and water. That's where your food comes from, and that's the definition of soil. So if we look at the impact different food factors have on the environment, we take soil as a starting point. So as a carbon store, it stores 2.5 gigatons of carbon. That's more than 3 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and over 4 times the amount stored in all living plants and animals. If we look after our soil, that can keep that carbon stored and take in more. It acts as a filter for water, taking out the sort of bad stuff out of water. It stores water, so minimises flood prevention. It's habitat for wildlife. So when we talk about good food, we talk about good soil care. If we don't cover it with chemicals and don't monocrop, we keep the soil healthier. So when we think about farming, the majority of people, when you ask what a farm looks like, will automatically tell you about the picture on the left. Green fields, small fields, wooded, and maybe having mixed animals on the farm. But in reality, many farms where our food comes from are actually intensive farming. And that's pictured on the right. So it's typically just having one crop, so monocropping, using chemical inputs, pesticides and fertilizers. Typically a low standard of animal welfare with a routine use of antibiotics. And across the globe, approximately 60% of all antibiotics are used in animal agriculture. We have this because of the demand for cheap meat products. Earlier, I talked about, in the little quiz that we had, we talked about chicken and how it used to be an expensive luxury food. And again, if we think about chicken now, this is the demand. We the public are demanding cheaper meat, and the supermarkets are providing that as loss leaders, and giving the population what they think they want. And 70 years ago, meat was seen as a treat, definitely not a staple of every meal. And the greenhouse gas emissions associated with land use for livestock are 16% of the total impact of food, whereas food for direct human consumption is 8%. Intensive farming contributes to deforestation, removing trees which are carbon capture tools and replacing them with dusty fields that you can see in the picture. England didn't always look like it does now. England was covered in trees at one point. So when we think about historically, we have gone through the same process of deforestation that is happening globally now, but it's just longer. It's just a long time ago, so nobody sort of remembers what it used to be like. And when we cover everything with chemicals, we take away the trees that affects wildlife, so the abundance and diversity of life. And so far in the UK, there's 33 species that have become extinct that is directly linked to the way that we produce food on our farms. And it's not just in the UK, because a lot of the issues that we have around food, we've actually shipped abroad. So we import a lot of food. So this is happening globally because of an increased demand for imported food. When we put pressure on places like Kenya and to grow green beans so that we can have green beans throughout the year, what we're actually doing is stealing their water and affecting people around the globe so that we can eat food that is out of season. Then we think about food processing. So what happens to food once it's actually been farmed? And the more processed the food is, the higher carbon impact it has. There's lots of inputs that go into processing foods. So you move through the food processing scale, and usually the more highly processed that a food is, this sort of worse it is for the environment and for health. All food, or the majority of food that we get, is packaged. And food packaging represents around 5% of the global house gas emissions of food. And we know that food needs to be transported, so it does need to be put into something. And packaging helps prolong the life of food. So it has an important role to play in ensuring that food stays fresher for longer. Although we know that a lot of packaging is unnecessary, and there are good ways to set about reducing that. Transportation. We talk about food miles a lot, and the majority of food is transported like this on a cargo ship, which is comparatively low impact way of transporting food, to say something like air freight. And food transportation contributes to 6 to 10% of all the greenhouse gas emissions associated. And when we think about reducing food miles, supporting the local economy, which also supports local jobs, goes a long way to reducing this impact. Storage. Once we have the food, we've got to store it under the right conditions, otherwise it will perish. And the packaging can help here, but typically we use refrigeration, whether in large cold rooms and freezers or in displays in a supermarket shelf. Many refrigerants, such as CFCs, damage the ozone layer, while others are extremely potent greenhouse gases. And on top of this, they require electricity to keep them running. So looking at energy use in food storage in kitchens and switching to renewable sources is a really positive step. And then we look at energy use in the kitchen. 60% of the energy used in kitchens is predicted to be wasted energy dispersed into the kitchen as heat. In catering facilities, it's typically between 4 and 6% of the energy costs. So we've talked about how forests have been dug up, and we've been putting pesticides on the soil, we've put antibiotics into animals, transported the food around the world, used energy to package, process, store and heat it all, and then we throw most of it in the bin. And then on top of that, we pay somebody to actually take it away for us. A third of all food that's produced is wasted. That's 1.3 billion tonnes. So 30% of the world's agricultural land may as well not be used because the food that comes from it is wasted. I'm not going to speak in great detail on health, I just wanted to summarise some points. Healthy diet is defined as those using less processed whole foods that are balanced across food groups and high in fruit and vegetables that are good for our health. The opposite diet is bad for our health, but this diet also has secondary impacts too, such as chemical cocktails from pesticide, fertilizer use, proven cancerous, antimicrobial resistance, so the build-up to antibiotics when we ingest them through food, making antibiotics less effective when we need them. Air pollution. So we've talked about transporting food, heating food, cooling food. All this contributes to pollution. So as a rule, we know that a healthy diet equals a healthy planet. And just as an aside, the NHS contributes 5.4% of the UK's total carbon emissions. So if we break down those numbers, we can see that food does impact on the environment, nature and health. So what can we do to instigate change? Well, this is where public sector and the power of public sector procurement come in. We all engage with food because we eat it, and some people have more influence on food than others. For example, I do the shopping in my household, so I have lots of influence over what we eat. And sometimes that's not that popular. But as I buy it, I influence it. I also talk to my friends a lot. My friends and family get sick of hearing me banging on about food and what's good and what people should be eating. But I probably do have some influence on their food decisions also, especially when they're out and about with me. I also know that in my role, I try and lead by example. So for instance, it's no good me telling my friends and family that they should buy only from farms that don't use chemicals and then covering my food in chemicals. And you probably have the same influence over the people that are in your life. And then there are the people who have influence on food in their jobs. And this is where the huge power of public sector procurement comes in. As we've just seen, food can be seen as quite a complex system. You have soil scientists, ecologists, farmers, nutritionists, and dietitians all having different specialisms in food that take years of study and research. Yet we find that lots of decisions made around food are made by other people. So we talk about the difference between food options and food choices. And you make it clear that you might have some part to play in shaping food choices. Customers, or such as patients in a hospital, are presented with food options that someone else has chosen for them. You need to make sure that all these options are good ones, good for the health and the environment. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that food's made up of lots of different issues and different processes, and that we can have influence on food in different ways. There are lots of different inputs and outputs that can make food that is good or bad for the planet. Luckily, we're not the only ones that have come to this conclusion. Others have too. But first, let me introduce a global concept some of you may be familiar with. These are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a set of targets agreed by the UN member states. Sustainable Development Goals build on the Millennium Development Goals, seeking to address new priority areas. And the purpose is to end all forms of poverty, fight inequalities, tackle climate change, while ensuring no one is left behind. And you can see from these goals here how they reflect some of the topics we've just been discussing around clean water, clean energy, responsible consumption and production, and climate action. So if we link this back to food, over at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, they presented a case for interconnectivity between food and the Sustainable Development Goals. Food is cultivated in the biosphere by society, impacting and contributing to our domestic and global economies. And we must recognise that there is no hope to eradicate poverty, fight inequalities and tackle climate change without food security. And acknowledging that food security can't be achieved without issues like overexploitation of the oceans, deforestation and soil degradation is key. We must also link food to health, well-being and equality, with obesity and malnourishment prevalent across the UK and in the world. These topics cannot be addressed in isolation. We should celebrate the role that food can play in sustainable development and its symbiosis with health and culture, rather than its hectare per hectare productivity. So if we look around the world or in Europe, what are other countries doing about this? Well, France has high targets for organic, which is 50% in public sector food by 2022. And they also have high targets for local produce. There's been a strong call for protecting soils in law. This has been a hot topic of discussion in the EU, leading to recommendations from the United Nations. Unfortunately, this has yet to pass, but is under review at present. Danish government are funding businesses to make more organic food available to the public sector. And Iceland have a focus on green energy production. So there's lots of good examples from around the world. And what do we have in place in the UK? Well, there is some advice there. We've got the government guidelines like Defra's Balanced Scorecard, the government buying standards, school food standards, and there's recently been a hospital food review that's come out with key recommendations about food. New farming payments that are supporting farming with nature rather than against it. And then every now and again, the Department for Business, Energy and Industry put out energy efficiency schemes for kitchens. Distilling all this down into something practical to use in a setting can be a bit of a challenge. Because as I said earlier, we can't all be experts in farming, procurement and nutrition. So there's lots of people that have done that bit for you. I'm going to show us a couple of solutions and talk you through some of the work that we do and how settings have applied that. So with the Soil Association, we have 2 sustainable catering standards in Food for Life Served Here and the Green Kitchen Standard. Food for Life Served Here concentrates on the food on the plate and looks at where that comes from, offers a minimum baseline of standards, followed by continued improvement through silver and gold. The Green Kitchen Standard specifically looks at energy waste and water coming out of the kitchen and provides an action plan of how that can be mitigated. In Food for Life Served Here, we have caterers in all sectors serving over 2.1 million meals a day that meet these requirements. And over 60% of those meals served are at the silver and gold level, which shows that within public procurement, you can look at issues around sustainability, health and nature. And we've done some work on how Food for Life Served Here standards fit in with the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned earlier. And you can see that there's a lot of crossover there. And this presentation will be available afterwards if anybody wants to look at that in more detail. And what I wanted to give was a few examples of where we think that people, sites are excelling in their procurement towards public sector. So we've got Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London who have really looked at using local produce and are cutting down on food miles and doing a study about that. All of their food is produced fresh on site, reducing the carbon associated with processed foods. They use at least 5% organic produce and are supporting farmers that are raising organic food and not using routine use of antibiotics. They use all free-range eggs and they're only using fish that's certified sustainable by the Marine Conservation Society. We've also got East Lancashire Hospital who have tackled food waste head on with a multidisciplinary approach and looking at ward level food audits. So what food on the plate is being wasted and given ownership of that to the dietetics team with measures introduced to really look at what's being eaten once the food is served. We've also just done a project with East Lancs Hospital and Forestry England, which has been really interesting. And I think East Lancs Hospital are the first hospital trust to actually start procuring wild venison. And this has come about because Forestry England, especially over the COVID pandemic, have seen a real drop in the need, in the sort of demand for venison, and they need a way to sustainably manage their forests. Whereas East Lancs Hospital Trust were already buying venison, but when they look back down into the supply chain, the majority of it was coming from from Scotland actually, and had around about 5 processing bits before it got to the hospital. So we've worked with Forestry England and East Lancs Hospital Trust, and East Lancs Hospital Trust have now just started taking in venison from their local forest, the Forest of Bowland, which is a fantastic story. And they're that's turning out to be their most popular meal deal. So they offer a wild venison pie with herby mash and vegetables, a fruit pot and water for around £3.10. And it's a really popular, and I think they're sort of leading the way in showing what can be achieved in a hospital, and the spending power that they've got is amazing. And they're working with lots of local suppliers. And then we've got the government of Jersey, who have just started really looking at their water, energy and waste on the island, working with their prison schools and hospitals, who are all starting their journey at the same time, and really looking at how they can reduce the impact of the water and energy that they use, which is particularly important for an island nation, especially water. And they're looking at also waste, and some waste on the island goes to landfill at the moment, so they're looking to mitigate that. So there's some examples there, and I thought I'd finish really by talking about giving some tips as to what, I understand that everyone's influence over food might be different, and perhaps you have an in-house team that have been with you for a long time, or perhaps it's a contracted caterer that changes every few years. But either way, you can start them on the path to more climate-friendly food. So expect what you ask for. And we get a lot of sites that seem confused when their catering service is not luxury cuisine or is not to the standards that they expect. But you actually get what you pay for and what you ask for. So I think right back, the contracts that we put in place for public sector food need to be really clear on what the requirements are, and they need to be monitored once they start. Investing in staff is absolutely key. It's unlikely that your team have been taught about sustainable practice in kitchens or supply chains. So by helping them see your vision and supporting them with training, you do get them on board. Engaging external help. We've talked about that not everybody's an expert in environment, farming or nutrition. There's lots of support and guidance out there. So use that, and don't think that you've got to be an expert in everything. Try and get everybody on board and engage your stakeholders early on. And stakeholders could be your staff, it could be your suppliers, it could be the board in a hospital or the school, but get them engaged earlier on and really try and sell that vision of public sector food. And I think welcome change and innovation. Be brave in the decisions that you make and try something new. Just because something's been done the same way for 30 or 40 years doesn't mean that that's the right way or that we can't change that. So I think really thinking about how to improve and being brave is important. And then, as I said right at the beginning, our food systems do contribute to and can mitigate against climate change. And whatever you do, the choices that you make decide whether food increases the rate of climate change or mitigates against it. And as I've discussed, the power of the public sector in influencing this is huge, and that's what we're working towards changing. So that's my bit. I would welcome any questions or any comments. Now that I've finished my presentation, though, I am going to hand over to Lucy from the Scotland team, who's going to talk us through some of the fantastic work that they've been doing up in Scotland. I can't see the chat at the moment. When I stop sharing my screen, I will have a look and see if there's anything in there. And I can come back to questions at any point during the session. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that. for you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Great. I can't see anyone's videos anymore, so I wasn't sure. So yeah, as Karen said, I work with her on Food for Life, but I'm based in Scotland, and I work in the Scottish team. So we look after the local authorities in Scotland who are award holders on Food for Life or working towards that. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the programme up in Scotland, but also how this can be used as a mechanism to incite the kind of change that Karen was outlining and address some of the problems that we're seeing in our food system and in the environment as well. So we're focusing on local and sustainable sourcing. So just a little bit of a background of what Food for Life Served here is. Karen touched on this slightly, but I'll just share the basics for those that don't know. So it's an award that is independently verified by an annual inspection, and in Scotland we just work with local authorities on school meals, but as Karen said, across the UK it's in lots of different other settings like hospitals and care homes. So it's really all about kind of rewarding caterers who are working towards a better standard of food. So we're looking to encourage them to serve more fresh food, to source more environmentally sustainable and ethical food, make healthy eating easier, and also championing their local food producers. So we have a set of standards, and it's at bronze, silver and gold level. These are some of the standards here. So we ask that 75% of the menu is made from fresh ingredients and is freshly prepared, and that the menu is free from additives and trans fats and genetically modified ingredients. We ask that all meat served meets UK welfare standards, that eggs are from free-range hens, no fish is served from the MSC food, fish to avoid list, and also that menus comply with national nutritional standards, and that they really focus on seasonal produce, display information about their suppliers and about the provenance of the food. And then, excuse me, also at silver and gold level, it's more of a focus on looking at ethical and more sustainable food choices like organic and free range outdoor bred, things like that. So that's just a little bit of background on the actual Food for Life Served Here standards. And this is the scheme in Scotland. So we currently have 16 local authorities across Scotland who are Food for Life award holders. So total sites, that's 1,152, and it just had me thinking when Karen was talking about McDonald's, and there's 1,400 McDonald's, I think you said, across the UK. If a supplier was to think about the business opportunity of supplying into every McDonald's in the UK, they would think, wow, that's a really great opportunity there. But actually, there's so many schools. And these are only the 16 local authorities that are certified with Food for Life. So it's a huge, huge impact there of the food that's going onto the plate and into mouths every single day. And so these local authorities are really putting in that effort to change the quality of that food, which impacts the environment and society as a whole. So it's really a sector that shouldn't be overlooked. So that's what we're operating at the moment in Scotland, which is 19.8 million meals every year that are served, which are Food for Life certified. So a little bit about our team in Scotland and what we do and how we work. So we work a little bit differently because we're directly funded by the Scottish Government. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, there's an election coming up here soon, and one of the manifestos did cite that they wanted Food for Life to be in every school and in every catering possibility in Scotland. So looking at expanding it to hospitals and other catering settings. So that's a huge endorsement for actually the difference that Food for Life can make. And up here we have a team. So we have partnerships managers, we have menu and catering skills who actually work with the local authorities to look at their recipes, and maybe that's to include more pulses or more seasonal food, and also help to train the staff, and help look at the menu overall. And then we have a data analysis support, which looks at actually what local authorities are buying and help to analyse opportunities of where they could be buying more local food, and where they could streamline their spend to make it more efficient for them, but also have more opportunities for more ethical food and more local food. And then we also offer supply chain support, which is what I am talking about today. So that's my my role. And I'll go into a little bit more on that later on. So as I said, we work directly with the local authorities, and really our key push is to get more Scottish food into Scottish school meals. So we're looking at local sourcing, and that really connects into community wealth building, which is a huge focus for councils. So investing that public money back into public goods, public services, local businesses that are going to provide local employment, and also, when it's more ethically and sustainably produced, then you're actually putting that value back into the environment as well. So yes, I'll talk a little bit more now about supply chain. I've got a video. I'm hoping that you can hear this. Let me know if you can't.
Yeah, I can.
Great.
We've been working with Food for Life to increase the amount of Scottish produce that we have on our menu. And Food for Life really helped us by putting us in touch with suppliers and local suppliers, and we've now seen the benefit. Pupils and parents really recognise the importance of locally sourced produce and knowing where their produce comes from.
So over the last few years, I think it's safe to say a lot of the councils have been a much more focus on local Scottish sustainable produce. So if you look back, say 7-8 years ago, it was about getting the best price. Whereas if you skip forward to today, we're making sure it's got the animal welfare standards in place, that it's coming from local and sustainably sourced places or coming locally from Scotland, that there's an emphasis on the food miles, so we don't want it travelling halfway across the world if we can grow it in our own country.
80% of our butchery meat is now sourced in Scotland. We're looking at a pilot of locally sourced vegetables now. A lot of people think it's going to cost substantially more, and certainly for our award, we've not seen any cost increase for going for the Bronze Award.
So that hopefully gave you a little bit of an insight to the work that we do, and how it affects the local authorities and how they feel actually about engaging with their local suppliers and more seasonal produce as well. So this is just a bit more about how we work across the supply chain in Scotland, and how we try and impact the food system. So we work from producer through to supplier and wholesaler, and also through to the local authority, and really everyone in between. So when we look at producer and grower stage, we're really trying to encourage new entrants into public procurement. So it's looking at developing markets, driving more demand for that local food, but also to tell suppliers, producers and growers out there that there's another market opportunity that they might have overlooked in public procurement. And actually these local authorities want to invest in their local suppliers, and they want to buy really great quality Scottish produce. So it's about really highlighting that as an opportunity, because many suppliers would not consider that a route to market for them, but it really can be a really valuable route to market. So we also link up growers with producers, with suppliers, with wholesalers, to try and find a way for them into the supply chain, and also signpost them to other industry stakeholders that can support their growth. And then when we get to the supplier stage, which can be a middleman, depending, some of them are also the growers, but it's about facilitating the best outcome between the local authority and the suppliers. And they actually need to understand about Food for Life and why local authorities want to engage in this journey, and why, you know, sustainability is important, because they have to support the local authorities in achieving the award and also in retaining the award. So it's things like why seasonal produce is important to them, and why they want to engage with their suppliers on what's the best available now, and planning, you know, for future seasons. And we also work really hard to celebrate success and recognize the hard work of the suppliers, within, you know, kind of rewarding them, and really highlighting their great work with PR. And then when we get to the local authority, we obviously support them to get the award, and help them retain it. But also we really focus on identifying opportunities for them to increase their Scottish sourcing. So they might not know what is available in their local area, or, you know, may not have realized the opportunity that exists in what they're already buying, because, I mean, they're very, very busy people, and they're juggling a lot of boards. They've got a lot to contend with. So actually really delving into what they're purchasing is a really great opportunity to highlight some areas that could be more localized, or you know, look at some smaller kind of SMEs to get involved in the supply. And we also help troubleshoot any problems with the supply chain related issues. So just generally on public procurement, why should suppliers even get involved? Why is it a great market? Well, in Scotland, local authorities spend over £150 million a year on public food. So that is so much money that, you know, if they're buying imported produce or highly processed products, actually that money could be going back into the local economy. But it is very complex, and every local authority works differently. But as I said, it can really provide a valuable route to market for suppliers. And local authorities are actually really good clients to have, because the contracts are very long term. They're usually, you know, around 3 years. The good payments terms, they pay their bills on time, and they're reliable. But, you know, that being said, there is constraints of public procurement legislation. But we work with a lot of pilot projects which offer more flexibility in that. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. So this is one of our pilot projects in Scotland that we're running with a farm on the Isle of Arran called Woodside Arran. So it's hyper-local supply. So this farm is on the island, and they're supplying fresh produce into the local authority schools and the care home. And it really started because they already knew the community on the Isle of Arran. They were selling to their kind of neighbours and to the local community, and they had this idea that, you know, why shouldn't they be supplying to their local schools and the care home? They're buying food, the kids are eating it every day, so why should it not be coming from down the road? So that was a really, really great place to start, because they were very passionate. And so we connected them in with the local authority, North Ayrshire, who also really saw the opportunity in this. So a little bit of kind of facilitation and connecting it all up, and now they do supply those schools and also the care home. And this is just a really great example of how that money from the local authority is going directly into this farm. And they use a community supported agriculture model, which means that the local community are really involved with what's happening on the farm, and they can get involved with the growing of it, with the picking, and be really connected into that land and know what's going on, and feel like they have some power over their own food system, which is quite rare these days. And also, you know, they're very ethically and sustainability focused in everything that they do. So it's putting public money into really a public good. And since starting this project, they've attracted a huge amount of attention. from lots of other councils and similar operations that want to achieve the same thing. So they've had more funding from a couple of different places. They've employed more staff, and now they can expand. They've invested in more polytunnels so they can grow more. And they've been featured in North Ayrshire's community wealth building strategy, which again is a real signal that the council really believe in this type of model, and they want to see it, happen more often, which is spreading across the country. And then just another little example to highlight, this one's from West Lothian. So this is just an example to show how actually something like Food for Life can be used as a mechanism to really make a change in the food system. So as I mentioned before, one of the standards is that to comply with the Food for Life Served Here award, local authorities must commit to serving meat that is from UK farms with animal welfare standards. And so that often converts local authority spend from imported processed meat to UK meat and local suppliers. So this example with West Lothian, they joined the scheme in 2018, and when we looked at their data a year later to see how it tracked for that first year that they'd been on the scheme, 95% of their fresh butcher meat and 88% of all meat that is served in the primary schools is now sourced from Scotland. So that's products that were coming before from much further afield, out of the UK, no farm assurance, and now they've transferred all of that spend into a local supplier, into local farmers, into a really high quality product. So now they're serving Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, specially selected pork, which has assured provenance. It has the local supply chain, and it's investing back into that local supplier and also the Scottish farmers. So that's a really nice example of how just changing a couple of things can make a massive difference. And we've probably all heard enough about COVID, but I just wanted to really quickly talk about that and how it has shone a light on our food system and the insecurities in it, which I'm sure we can all agree. It brought a lot of attention onto our food system. So all round, it was kind of noticed that shorter and more local supply chains and smaller businesses actually seemed to fare better with the crisis. And we were noticing that local authorities already had a local supply chain in place, recognised their suppliers and the strength that they had in that local supply chain, and worked really hard to utilise that. And we were noticing that local authorities we knew which held the Food for Life Served Here award, they'd already prioritised local suppliers, because it's part of the process of holding the award is that you actually look at your supply and look at what you can do more locally. So they already knew their suppliers and had a good relationship with them. And so through the chaos of the first lockdown and trying to find food to help the community and people who are shielding, they really prioritize their local suppliers in that. So when we noticed this, we thought we'll just do a little bit more work actually to delve deeper into this and see what's happening. So we did some interviews with suppliers and also local authorities and wrote up some case studies. So these are all on our website. Actually, I can share the link later if anyone's interested. But what we found from doing those case studies was that the suppliers that we spoke to were very, very passionate about the supply, and they felt like they didn't want to let down their community. It was their moment, that they needed to step forward and support the local authorities and the community. So, we found that these local, smaller suppliers were reliable and were really committed to it. And they managed to adapt to the changes in the supply chain really quickly. So that could be before they were supplying, food just for school meals. And now they're supplying thousands of boxes every week to go out to members of the community who are shielding. And one small supplier said to me that he likened it to ships. And, you think of a huge, big ship, it's going to be quite hard for them to turn around quickly. But he said, their business, it was just him and another person who were leading it. And he was like, we're just a small little boat. We can turn really quickly and pivot to change what we're doing to suit, what was needed. that's what we saw from the smaller suppliers, that they were able to pivot to different models, different approaches, and a lot of that was direct to consumer as well. So they were doing veg boxes, they had literally overnight managed to get an online kind of a website up where people could buy online and do click and collect and do deliveries. So that was really amazing to see, and just shines a light on actually how incredible these suppliers are and the work that they do is. And from the local authorities, we found that they really relied very heavily on their local suppliers. And they gave those suppliers more flexibility on products and budgets just to support other local businesses. So we saw an example up in Argyll and Bute of a supplier who before was just supplying fruit and veg, but actually they needed to get more food into these community parcels. So they said, you know, do what you can, support local businesses. So they had local cheese going in and local dairy products, and all of these local businesses working together to support the community. And the local authorities really recognised that commitment to supply. So that was really lovely to see as well. So that is all from me. A very quick run through, but yeah, I hope that was interesting for you. And if you have any questions or anything, let me know. My email address is there as well if anyone wants to get in touch.
Thanks, Lucy. That was really interesting and really inspiring as well, especially the bits about COVID and the importance of that local supply. So we've heard now about sort of the wider issues around food and some more localised solutions there from Scotland. We've now got Rich Osborne, who's going to talk to us about dynamic food procurement. I'll let Rich do his introduction, but I am watching the chat. If anybody has got any questions, then more than happy to have a discussion or to talk about them. So yeah, I have allowed some time for questions, so please do feel free. But I'll hand over to Rich now. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Can someone confirm they can hear me and see my screen?
Well, I can.
Yes,
Thanks, Rich. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. Well, first of all, yeah, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed those last two presentations. The Food for Life program, in my experience, reasonably limited experience, I guess, but has been a really important kind of yardstick that people can really get around and form around and use to really drive improvement in food sourcing. I've seen it happen a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about another case in Bath in this presentation where it really was an important element of the case. My name's Rich. I actually my main job is managing Equilibrium Markets, which is a technology company that helps to facilitate dynamic food procurement and consolidation and delivery. But today I'm speaking on behalf of the Dynamic Food Procurement Advisory Board, which basically has similar aims to the Food for Life program, which is to increase the percentage of food that's procured in the public sector from fresh, local, sustainable suppliers. So today I'm just going to talk about why the public sector is such an important part in terms of taking the lead on food procurement. I'm going to talk about how public sector procurers can address really major world problems, many of which Karen did a great job of summarising, and why dynamic food procurement can really be the foundation on which change can be built, and why it's such an important piece of the jigsaw. So why must public sector take the lead? You know, surely the private sector catering market is much bigger. I think it's about 40 times bigger, and the grocery market again is probably more than that, bigger, 50 times, 60 times bigger than the public sector market. Well, really, I think there are a few pretty good reasons why the public sector needs to be the change. First of all, it's a lot of money. We spend over £2 billion a year on public sector food and catering, and this is public money. It's taxpayers' money, and so taxpayers' money should be used for public good. And Lucy just gave some great examples of where that is happening. Unfortunately, that's not happening on a wide enough scale. There are great examples, but it's too much of the money is not being spent in a way that is doing public good. The fact is, a lot of us eat a public sector meal each day. And so if we can serve up a public sector meal to those people that can inspire those consumers of public sector meals to make positive changes themselves, it can have a real halo impact. It can really reach all demographics of society and inspire them to change what they do, much in the way that Karen was describing earlier. She does all the time by talking to people about the food, where food's come from, how it's been produced, what the impact is of different food choices. There are really good examples of how the public sector has led. Others have then followed in the private sector and in the grocery channel, and fish is a really good example of this, where you heard Lucy talking about MSC fish and the red list of fish that to avoid. The public sector have really led on this piece, and it's by pushing and insisting on sustainable fish that it's caused the suppliers of that fish to have to implement new supply chain infrastructure that can then also be used in other sectors easily. Once they've set it up for the public sector, sustainable fish supply chains, might as well sell it into the private sector as well. And that we've really seen that happen on sustainable fish. But the last reason is, and I think again, Karen, you brought this to life very well, there's a real level of complexity that needs policy coherence around food. There are so many different issues that it's a pretty big ask to expect a private hospitality business that's right now cash strapped and struggling just to survive to take on and work out on their own how to address that complexity. And this slide for me really helps to sort of pull it all together. There are probably more issues than these 5 bubbles to consider, but I see these as probably the 5 biggest challenges that the food system has to address. So starting from the left, there's the whole regional economy piece that we've heard about already from Lucy, and the impact it can have on SME producers if you're procuring food from them. And that also leads to a resilience, that can lead to improved resilience within a region that we've heard about in the COVID-19 example. And that can deliver food security for people within a local region. The food system, as you saw Karen present, generates up to 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gases. That is a huge amount of greenhouse gases being generated by the food system. It's probably responsible for the vast majority of the utter decimation of biodiversity globally over the last 40 years. And food waste is a massive issue. I mean, if you just look at food waste purely from the carbon or greenhouse gas perspective, if food waste were a country, it would be 3rd behind the US and China in terms of how much greenhouse gases it releases into the atmosphere. And last but absolutely not least, nutrition. The biggest cost to the NHS in the UK today is diet-related disease. It's a bigger killer. Diet-related disease is the biggest killer now, medically within the UK. The thing is it's very easy to start to focus in on one of these issues and try and address it, and then lose sight of, by addressing that one issue, how that you might create a spillover impact in one of these other issues. So you might make progress in one area like climate change, but then cause an issue in terms of biodiversity. So this is I'm just trying to make the point here that the complexity of getting this right and making the right decisions is really significant. And governments really are who we elect in order to address complex policy needs. So that's why the public sector really needs to step up. I'm not going to cover this slide because I think Karen's already done a great job, but I just do want to give an example of, you can start to go down one channel and think about, say, climate change as an issue to address. And as Karen shared, the percentage of greenhouse gases that are emitted by the food system actually represent about a third of global greenhouse gases overall that are caused by humans. But the vast majority of the greenhouse gases caused by the food system actually sit, 24% of all human-caused greenhouse gases actually sit in agricultural production. So it's the way food is produced that is the largest determinant of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions within the food system. I want to share this film, and again, I'm sharing this film, it's only 60 seconds long, because I want to make the point that it's very easy to draw a conclusion to address one of these issues that then has a spillover impact in another area. And in the past few years, there's been quite a binary debate around meat, for example. So you've heard some public sector institutions declare, right, we're just not going to serve meat anymore. No beef. We'll take it all off our menu because beef is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases overall. But I'm just going to enlist the support of some familiar faces here to explain that there's a more nuanced debate that needs to happen, and informed choices need to be made that are a bit more nuanced than just, do we have meat or not, or do we just reduce the amount of meat or not. It's a bit more to it than that. So I'll play the film and then
I'll just say, Rich, we can't hear we can't hear it.
Oh, I could hear it.
Oh, it's just me then, sorry.
No, it's not just you. I cannot hear it either.
Oh,
I
really?
could hear it.
I couldn't hear it.
so
strange.
not everyone can hear it.
No.
That's frustrating.
If we can go back, I'll see if there's something that I can do on mine, but I couldn't hear it.
Okay, well, it's nearly finished. I'll just let it run through, and then I'll summarise.
Okay.
So basically, what Chris Packham was saying and Miranda Kristofnikov was saying is we need to make nuanced choices around beef, and it's not what Chris Packham said was, if you were to do away with all of beef tomorrow, and there were no cows anymore in fields, it would have massive detrimental impacts on biodiversity. So there needs to be a more nuanced approach than that. And so and so can you see my screen still now? Everything still working? I haven't broken the share, have I?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can still see.
Yeah, good. So so the point is that as the point was made earlier, too much of our food travels through very long supply chains that are not transparent. And so if we're to act and make informed choices on food, down to the level of what they're fed, what animals are fed, or how they're grazed, it's almost expecting too much of food buyers to make those choices when food is traveling along such long, opaque supply chains. And actually, Victoria Prentice, who's the Undersecretary for DEFRA, in a recent inquiry into public sector food procurement, actually quite openly admitted that the government spends £2 billion plus on public sector food and catering, and they don't really know where that money's being spent. And in fact, she said they've probably never known. And it was actually quite encouraging to hear her say that, not because they don't know where they're spending their money, but because they're acknowledging it as an issue, and they're really determined to put it right. So I hope I've made the case that public sector food procurement really needs to be taking the lead, and it could well be the fastest route to catalyse change. And that in order to do that, short, transparent, sustainable food supply chains are really a must. And actually, if you look at each of the cases that Lucy shared, they were all cases where short supply chains were in place, and it meant they knew very clearly what they were buying. So that's why public sector needs to do it. Now I'll get into how public sector procurers can really get into solving world problems. And the first piece I'd like to share is, and you can access this at that web URL there, it's just a screen grab of the website, on the Dynamic Food Procurement Advisory Board website, is that the largest procurement body in the UK, the Crown Commercial Service, have said they're going to launch the Future Food Framework in 2022. So firstly, they'll do this via a pilot in the southwest of England, but then subsequently they'll launch across all regions of the UK from 23. And the government say that this Future Food Framework, led by CCS, has the potential to improve food security, environmental performance of catering, reduce diet-related disease burden, and boost regional economies across every region of the UK, all whilst driving value for the public purse. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? But actually, in the recent government inquiry I mentioned earlier, it's been hailed by the Soil Association's head of policy, Rob Percival, as being a potentially transformative game changer. Sustain are also supporting it. The NFU are supporting it. The Pasture Fed Livestock Association are supporting it, and I'm persuaded it may well feature in Henry Dimbleby's forthcoming national food strategy as well. So how will it work, the Future Food Framework? Well, the framework will enable schools, hospitals, prisons and military procurers to buy food along short supply chains, transparent supply chains, and to buy them from SME producers in their own region, thus enabling informed choices to be made on the footprint of food. And CCS have said the framework will be based on the Bath and North East Somerset dynamic food procurement pilot. Now, you may have heard of that, or you may not, but this was a pilot that took place back in 2016, and it was thanks to a couple of really courageous procurement officers who decided as part of their local food strategy that they wanted to dramatically improve the choice of local produce available to school cooks. 3 years later, after they made that decision, there were over 100 school cooks who had prepared more than 2 million meals with produce sourced from more than 20 new sustainable local producers and suppliers. So the pilot brought more fresh local produce from more local businesses, but importantly, they managed to do that at county level at a lower financial and environmental cost than before. So the pilot was declared a success, and this is really where dynamic food procurement as a concept was born. So what is dynamic food procurement? Basically, dynamic food procurement needs a technology and management agent to sit in it, kind of at the heart of all of the transactions around food. And effectively, the technology and management agent facilitates the supply chain from farm gate via a logistics processor or supplier through to the kitchen. The key difference between dynamic food procurement and frameworks, a dynamic food procurement framework and conventional frameworks, is that conventional frameworks tend to appoint one supplier per lot. So you'll have one supplier for fruit and veg, one supplier for meat, one supplier for frozen food, one supplier for ambient store cupboard items. With dynamic food procurement, you are able to contract with multiple primary producers on a dynamic purchasing system, which is an existing form of EU procurement that's used in other areas already, like stationery, for example. But it hasn't been used in food due to the complexities around fulfilling fresh food from a number of different producers within the area. So that's where the technology comes in, is it enables the producer fulfillment and consolidation to take place in a way that works along short, sustainable, transparent food supply chains, and then arranges a very convenient customer delivery experience, so that what the cook gets is the food, what food they want, when they want it, and from the producers they choose, all in one delivery. And what Bath were able to show is, and these are sort of examples of material that was used to promote to parents and children the supply chains that were used to cook their lunch, was that you could not only name the producer, but you could give information about how the animals were fed, what certification there was around the food. So, for example, RSPCA Assured or Soil Association Organic, and they were able to communicate quite granular pieces of information about what's actually in the produce, or in the meals, but also how that produce was produced, how that food was produced, including from some quite like the 7 Project was a great program that helped recovering drug addicts to grow to learn how to grow food, or ex prisoners also to learn how to grow food, and had some quite successful social outcomes. And what the pilot demonstrated was, if you communicate about the makeup of food and how important the sourcing policy is within a school, this can have a virtuous sort of cycle of improvement, because more parents will sign up their child for meals, more children actually enjoy the food more, and take up of meals increase. So some schools in this county managed to get meal take up to higher than 85%, which I'm told is a very high level of take up. And of course that in turn improves the profitability of the catering outlet in each school. So as profitability improves, you can actually afford to spend more on really great produce. So very briefly, how this is done. Producer-centric fulfillment is really the core element of this. It's treating producers as a customer, not just the buyers as a customer, by understanding really how the producer can supply their food, what days they can fulfill it, how much lead time they need, how long that food can then be stored in stock before it's shipped to the customer, to the cook. So actually, when you break down or you add up all the combinations for different parameters in supplying food, or for a producer's defining a producer's capability to supply their food, there are hundreds of thousands of permutations, and this is why so often big food supply companies just refuse to do it. They don't want to have to manage lots of little producers, and again, why dynamic food procurement is really such an important element. So that's it. I hope what I've conveyed is that you need short supply chain transparency within the public sector to address world challenges that we've covered today. Dynamic food procurement is a model that's proven and can help procurers make informed buying choices, but also it will enable measurement and ongoing enforcement of food standards, something that's been lacking outside of the Food for Life programme covered sites. So hopefully I've got that message across. And the final thing to say is, if you want to get in touch with the Dynamic Food Procurement Advisory Board, it's chaired by James Cashmore, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of the Soil Association, and Christine Story, who's a very experienced food procurement officer, coordinates the group. You can email me, or if you go to the website, you can find their contact details. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rich. That was really, really interesting and thought-provoking. And
Good.
there's been some comments, particularly around the issues talked around meat. So yeah, but really great. And we do welcome questions. If anybody's got any specific questions for any of us, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll answer them. So we're moving on now, and we've got Nigel Crane, who's works up in Lancashire. I'll let Nigel introduce himself and his role, but we can hear now about how Lancashire are approaching their food procurement and the changes that they've made. So I'll hand over to you, Nigel, but as I said, if anybody's got any questions, please do put them in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, some tough acts to follow this morning, and I'm quite sure that the vast majority of everything that I'm just about to talk about has already been covered in far more detail than I'll be covering. Unfortunately, I'm not the best at presenting, but I'll certainly do my best. So I've put together a little sorry, just right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now, can they?
Yes.
Yes,
Right,
can
thank you. Okay, so this will be the boring slideshow of this morning's session, along with my voice, which will probably put the majority of you to sleep. So my name's Nigel Crane. I'm the head of school and residential care catering for Lancashire County Council. Lancashire, for those of you who aren't that familiar with the authority, is one of the larger local authority areas. We have a population of 1.45 million, and we are the 11th largest local authority area in the country. Although with that being said, we are the 6th largest in terms of our size geographically. As the head of the service, I have a vested involvement and passion in relation to food and food procurement, and that's particularly important when we consider that we feed around 65,000 children and elderly residents a day, producing over 13 million meals a year. We are sizable as a food producing organisation, and with that along comes the responsibility for sustainable procurement. So to achieve that, we have set ourselves our objective of defining public sector caterers as having a moral and ethical responsibility to ensure that we consider where the food on our plates comes from, how it was produced, standards it was produced to, and we also want to positively influence the food choices of the children and young people that we serve. I feel that's quite important when we look at public sector and the core of our roles. We're not just there in a transactional manner. We're not just providing meals. There's a lot more, as colleagues have already attested to this morning, that revolves around food, and we see ourselves as a positive influencer in that respect. We want to be able to not only produce food which is to the highest standards and quality, but also which has a lasting effect on the children and young people that we're serving that food to. The more that they understand about food and what healthy food is, the better place they will be within their lives to ensure that they're making the right choices. So what is sustainable procurement within public sector? We're looking at the organisations meeting the needs of meeting their needs for goods and services in a way that reflects value for money, which is a given, which gives a range of generated benefits which touch on the social aspects, the local economy and the environment. And we look to try and achieve that by ensuring that our procurement decisions consider more than just value. As much as food is a cost, and cost is important, what we want to do is to ensure that when we're purchasing food, we're actually generating additional positive benefits wherever we can do. We look at that, I suppose, in the way that you would look at the circular economy. We want to try and achieve multiple layers of benefit from the use of public sector money, not only in terms of the quality of the food that we serve to the children, but also our local economy, the employment benefits that are available within the local economy, the stability of the businesses within the local economy, the wildlife, the geographical area that we live in. We want to see benefit going back into those areas, and we also want to incentivise existing businesses and SMEs to come and engage within our business model to gain benefit for themselves. We certainly see that the reduction in food miles is not only beneficial for the environmental impact, but also it's a money saving approach. If food has to travel less miles, it costs less to get to the distribution point. And that's one of the things that we certainly find through our accreditation to Food for Life Silver, is that whilst we are buying a higher standard of food, we're not necessarily seeing an increase in cost to be able to do that, because we're mitigating by reducing on some of those cost impacts that go into food production. I think it was earlier on Karen mentioned about foods coming from all over the world, either by air freight or by ship. All of those different travel routes add costs to that particular product. And when it all comes from the same base source, the way to mitigate some of that cost is very much to look at the local supply chain. So why don't the public sector purchase sustainably already? The procurement approach is probably the biggest factor. Public sector procurement is its own beast. It's very difficult and unwieldy. It isn't particularly easy for SMEs to engage within the public procurement sector in a way where they generally feel as though they can get the right messages across with regards to their supply chain, sorry, their product. So having a considered procurement approach, we found is particularly important. breaking down barriers to give SMEs an opportunity to either engage directly within tenders or to have options not to engage directly, but to have a route to market in place to be able to do that. So one of the things that we introduced in Lancashire was a distribution hub, which meant that SMEs could either contract directly with our distribution hub with their products, or alternatively, they could choose to tender directly in the knowledge that we had a distribution hub that dealt with the delivery aspect, so that the producers wouldn't have to worry about that. So if we look at procurement from the supply chain end, we can often come up with opportunities to break down those barriers, which limit SME involvement within public procurement. Supplier capability is another area, and particularly when we look at the volumes of food that we purchase here in Lancashire, we spend around £11.5 million a year on food, and over 50% of that is actually spent on produce which is either grown or produced within the Lancashire boundaries. Having the supplier capability to meet those needs isn't something that you can purely do by going through an open procurement tender. The suppliers need to understand what's needed, and they need to be able to build up their capability and capacity to deliver that. So engaging with suppliers before procurement, we find is vitally important in that respect. We can share our expectations around food, the volumes of food, the way that we operate. We only serve food over 190 days a year, which is the academic school year. And the more that we can engage with SMEs and small businesses to get their understanding of that in place, the better place they are to understand whether they can build that capability in to meet our needs. Distribution is vitally important. We have within our business around 500 primary schools, 30 secondary schools, 17 residential care homes and 5 daycare centres. So distributing fresh produce to that volume of outlets is a massively laborious task in its own right. So having a centralised distribution hub, as we have here in Lancashire, takes away those difficulties of getting local produce to the end user. We put that in place and ensure that delivers the need without the supplier having to consider having to invest in more vehicles, bringing more vehicles into the Lancashire roads, and also adding to environmental impact, etc. If we can take away unnecessary distribution by contribute positively. Public sector procurement is limiting in its own right. There are a range of factors which we have to work within public procurement, and to be able to best exploit, or not exploit, but best benefit from local supply chain, you need to ensure that the public sector approach is understood and cleared when it comes to the expectations for what you wish to purchase. To do that within Lancashire, we actually established our own sustainable procurement strategy back in 2009, and within that strategy we outlined a number of different aims, which I'll come on to in a little more detail, but that very much set the local authority food procurement expectations to a point that they became transparent and could then appear within our public sector procurement documentation, and that really does help to place a good strategic basis within procurement documentation that you can use continuously to improve those standards over a period of time. And the food nutrition standards is an area where I feel that probably local authorities are generally lacking in a type of understanding to be able to engage actively within the marketplace. Excuse me. An example of this would be within Lancashire, we had a desire to see the quality of our sausages improve, and not only to improve the nutritional makeup, but also to have the sausages available as gluten-free. We know the type of sausage we want because within our service we're fortunate enough to be able to understand the nutritional makeup and write that into a specification. That doesn't necessarily mean the marketplace is there and has the product available, but understanding the nutritional makeup of your food produce is quite important if you want to be able to influence wider agendas such as health. So our sausages are lower in salt. We control the meat content that goes into the sausage. We control the additive content that goes in there as well. And through having that understanding around food nutrition, we're better able to share with our suppliers or potential suppliers the type of products that we would like to see coming to market. So in terms of considering this for public procurement, as I mentioned, we set a range of objectives within our sustainable procurement strategy and split those across 4 key areas. So we look to ensure the economic aims by securing value for money, supporting local suppliers, encouraging suppliers to develop or enhance their own sustainable supply chains. An example of that would be our cheese producer, which is here in Lancashire. They actually produce cheese only with milk from dairy farms within Lancashire. And if we look at the food map of their milk purchasing for our cheese, we can see positive benefits within the local farming community to the point where they're actually seeing more dairy farmers wanting to reopen dairy farming because of the knowledge that there is a sustainable supply base in place to achieve that. We know because we've got that limited mileage on that milk that's another benefit to the economy, environment, sorry. It's adding to the economy through job creation, and it's also enhancing the countryside because the farmers are there taking care of that countryside. So they're really good examples of where we can see the extended benefits. While we're on the cheese supplier, reducing waste and energy use, our cheese supplier, as part of a tender activity a number of years ago, moved onto wind turbine power. So again, when we're purchasing our cheese, we know that we're contributing positively to greener energy use. And we also want to look to those savings to reinvest back into the supply chain. The environmental aims, I won't run through them, but obviously they link in with some of those economic aims. Our social aims, particularly in terms of feeding children, are very relevant, and raising awareness of the benefits and values of healthy and sustainably procured food. So to be able to do that, we engage with our suppliers. Our suppliers will put on open days for children to go and view farms or cheese production or whatever else it may be, which helps their understanding, particularly to break down the barriers around the supermarket negativity, vegetables arriving in plastic packaging. And over and above that, we also have a number of educational training sessions which we deliver to schools, which again are based around raising awareness of food and the positives and negatives of foods, the types of foods that are good for you, fuel, energy in, energy out, etc. So we're very much embedded in ensuring that those social aims around food are delivered in a continuous way. We obviously want to increase the access and consumption of healthy food in school meals. And we're quite fortunate in that respect. I think Rich mentioned a study there on his piece where a local authority had got their school meal uptake to 85% in Lancashire were higher than that. We're at 80, just under 87%, and we're quite confident that our school meals provision, when we look at the types of produce that we have on offer, and that local supply chain that we share with our schools, is all important in being able to achieve that level, and it's all the more important when we know that the quality of food that's going to those children is of the highest standards. And again, I won't go through all of these other bits and pieces, but just touching on the health aims, again, what we want to do through raising social awareness around food is to positively impact around those health aims. The growing levels of obesity in childhood is the obvious concern, and when we look at, again, our influence through our food choices, if we can control the types of food that children are coming into contact with, and get those across to the children in a positive way that they can understand why you would want to reduce levels of salt, sugar, etc., then again that will help them in their future life choices. So this is what it looks like for Lancashire. We're very proud of the fact that we are very Lancashire centric with our procurement approach, and that the vast majority of our fresh produce comes right here from Lancashire. And I think we were one of the first, if not the first, local authority to use a food map to promote that to our parents, our schools, and children. And when we look at the benefit of that map, we're contributing approximately 20 to 24 million pounds worth of benefit back into the Lancashire economy on an annual basis, as well as ensuring that we have our accreditation to Soil Association Food for Life Silver, which we've had now for, I think, 6+ years. All of the benefits that bring along in terms of our procurement divisions for farm assured meats, free range eggs, organic milk, etc. They're all great benefits which help Lancashire as an economy thrive and continue to grow as a food producing region. And then looking at some of the obstacles. Sorry, I'll drink. So the strategic planning, I think, is one of the bigger obstacles. If we look at food and food procurement, just having a decision to more healthily or more locally doesn't necessarily mean that there is a viable and sustainable supply chain in place to make that happen. So strategic planning by building contractual levers into public sector procurement can certainly benefit. So building up expectation prior to it actually being delivered certainly helps the supply chain be able to understand your route and gear up to be able to meet that demand within future tenders. Central procurement can be an obstacle, particularly in local authorities. Procurement has historically been driven towards value, which isn't necessarily the best thing within the food world. We're more committed to wanting to purchase fresh, wholesome, nutritious food rather than adulterated food, which can be cheaper. So having a strategy, a sustainable procurement strategy, can help influence those central procurement teams. They can better understand the direction of travel and what it is that you're trying to achieve. The nutritional profile of food is a particular area of interest to myself, and probably one that we see a level of either misunderstanding or lack of knowledge in general, both in the public sector but also in the general public. A sausage isn't a sausage. It can be 30% meat content, it can be stuffed with rusk, it can have GM crop in there to bulk it out. It can have pea proteins in there to bulk it out, or it can be a 70% meat content with less than 1 gram per 100 gram salt content. Knowing the nutritional profile of food is all important in being able to ensure that not only are you buying locally, but you're also influencing the nutritional impact of that food on the end consumer. Defining the value of food. I'd be interested if anyone can define the value of food. I don't think we necessarily can do. Its value is interpreted in different ways by different people. And likewise, when we look at local authorities, they don't tend to define the value of food in the way that looks at the overall benefits of what food can do in terms of health, well-being, environment, etc. So having a strategic plan, a strategic procurement policy in place to help define that value of food is vitally important. And then there's the intangible benefits which sit around the side. So we can estimate that we contribute somewhere towards 20 to 24 million pounds worth of financial value into Lancashire through our public sector procurement, but there are a number of intangible benefits which we can't necessarily measure in the same way. Example of this, let me think off the top of my head. So by focusing on a local sustainable supply chain for food, we're able to add certain benefits which don't really add a great deal financially, but which have benefits elsewhere. So the use of our distribution hub gave us the opportunity to have a central control point for incoming goods and obviously delivery onwards to our school kitchens. One of our sustainable strategies is to reduce the impact of food packaging. So by having a gateway where we can have the food coming in, they now become the control point for our food packaging requirements. So within their tender, they are required to only use type 3 and type 5 recyclable plastic packaging from their suppliers into that. Certainly that means that the packaging that we get in our recycling waste ones. So there isn't a financial benefit to that, but environmentally we are keeping up our approach to reducing the use of single-use plastics, which is a corporate objective, and ensuring that we're doing that in a way where we can control the process in a more tangible way to gain that benefit from it. So that's a little bit from me. I appreciate I'll probably whiz through that a little bit. As I say, I'm not the best at public speaking, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'd be happy to have a chat about anything else.
Thank you for that, Nigel. It's really, really informative. Yeah, we've just got one question come in, and I'm going to put it to Nigel, and maybe Rich could come in on it as well. Oh, just messing about with my video. We've had a question saying, how can public sector help mitigate risk and enable hospitality, small, medium enterprises to make more innovative decisions? Rich, Nigel, do either of you want to come in on that?
Yes, I will do. So through public sector procurement, we can engage with the marketplace in a positive way if we set that objective in the first instance. So, sorry, Karen, just read the question again, would you?
Yeah, it's how can public sector help mitigate risk and enable hospitality SMEs make more innovative decisions?
Yeah, sorry, it was yeah, just checking we got that mitigation of risk. So as mentioned previously, local authority procurement tenders tend to be for a significant period of time. We will generally tender on a 2+1+1 basis. So giving 4 years worth of continued benefit. Unlike other parts of the hospitality sector, certainly public sector tend to be more stable in terms of their deliverable expectations. You know, we work with the same volumes on a continuous basis. So by engaging in public procurement, you're almost mitigating risk by virtue of contracting with the public authority.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Rich, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Not really. I agree with everything Nigel just said. I'm not sure whether the question is directed at producers, food producer SMEs, or hospitality businesses beyond the public sector. But I'm not sure. Arash, do you want to clarify?
We've got he's saying I can't see the chat.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about government. Like, what are the? Do we have any sort of incentives for businesses, public or private, to actually start utilizing tools without having cost to them, or provide some new menu items that are like meatless or more sustainable without taking the risk away from hospitality sector, restaurants. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if whoever is the right person to answer that question.
So, I mean, I think Nigel already partly answered that, but as I said in my presentation, I think that for the reasons Nigel just gave, the public sector is a really good channel for producers to explore the supply of new products, and can give them a very sustainable source of demand. And as I mentioned about fish, once supply chains are built and set up for the public sector, then there's much more chance for them to be, because they're already operating at some scale, to then be able to serve the private sector. And it's why I was arguing so strongly for the need for public sector to step up and lead, because it will really help. It will act a little bit like a catalyst to enable that innovation and for that to move across sectors into private hospitality businesses as well.
Almost like a Trojan horse in a way, as a sort of in order to spread good practice. I had a question about the school meal take up across Lancashire. Now, I have two daughters, they're both teenagers, and for some reason they would rather have a packed lunch, which is, I think it's a shame. I don't know what's going on at the school canteen, but 87% school meal take up is fantastic, as Rich said. So a question for Nigel, how do you manage to do that, even though you list as one of the obstacles strategic planning and central procurement? So how have you managed to sort of manage these obstacles, as you call them, and still deliver such a high rate?
Okay. I think we're probably quite fortunate in that respect. Lancashire schools went through delegation of their catering arrangements back in 2000-2001. So at that time, the authority formed a commercially traded catering organisation. So whilst we are public sector, we have a foot in commercial business and share the influences of commercial business in our thinking and planning. So we have, as a catering organisation, we've tried to push beyond the acceptable requirements on a continuous basis. We've always wanted to see our food and food standards ahead of what the national expectations have been. Certainly before time, going back to the Jamie influence, we were actually compliant to the school food standards that came in 2006 before they came in. So we've always had that progressive approach. And I suppose coupled with that is, if you are providing a service which is based around moral and ethical supply of food that has that local benefit, it almost takes decision making away from your customer, because why wouldn't they engage? Why wouldn't they be there, being part of what is generally beneficial at every single touch point? That's really it. It's having that progressive approach and ensuring that we continue to focus very much on not only delivering a good quality of food service, but continuing to stretch those benefits so that parents, as well as children, as well as schools, as well as county councillors, etc., can all see those benefits in whichever way that they influence them.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. And I just add as well that there's very much around how the school sees the school meal, the school lunchtime as well, and the emphasis that they put on that in allowing children to have the time to actually eat their food. And we tend to find that so much more in secondary schools, the school lunchtime has been squeezed so much that sometimes children aren't comfortable in actually getting food and sitting down and eating it. And there can be advantages to having grab and go or a packed lunch system. And so much of that depends on the emphasis put on lunchtimes by the senior management team in the school, and we see that more and more, and we're really pushing for lunchtime to be seen as probably one of the most important times of the day, because good nutrition and good social skills that are sort of associated with lunchtime are an absolute crucial sort of educational engagement opportunity that I think so many schools actually miss out on. Which is why we see a drop off in school meals uptake in secondary schools. But yeah, okay, I think we've actually come to the end of the allotted time for the session. So thanks to those that have sort of hung around, and thanks to the speakers that have come along. Really appreciate it.